Hello and welcome to this video where we're going to talk about what you can start doing today to make your efforts to learn more effective. Now, we're going to start by talking about some of the physical things that go on inside of your brain when you're learning something, and then we're going to talk about how we can kind of make use of that knowledge to make our learning more effective. Now, there is another video after this one that you can go into that's more about like long-term things you can do. It's kind of the stuff that nobody really wants to do, but if you're really dedicated to mental fitness and being able to learn more effectively, it's definitely worth checking out. That one goes more into stuff like sleep and diet and exercise and stuff like that, and how it can impact your ability to learn and your brain's ability to repair itself. But with all of that said, the first thing we're going to talk about is kind of how memory works. So we're going to start by talking about like the highest level, which is working memory. Now, working memory is kind of like the bit of memory that is most accessible. It's like what you're hearing me say right now and how well you remember that. So like 10 minutes from now, if you tried to repeat what I just said word for word, you probably won't remember it exactly because it's only in your working memory. So one kind of good metaphor for this is that working memory is like what you can hold in your hand right now. So if you imagine like holding some piece of information, as long as you're holding it, you have it because it's in your working memory. So you could repeat back to me what working memory is right now, but then 10 minutes from now, you might not remember it quite as well. Now, on average, people can hold about 5 to 8 different specific things inside of their working memory at any given point in time. And this is really important because a lot of times people will try to do too many things at once, and then it just becomes impossible to keep track of all of those things. And then you're wondering why you weren't able to learn them all, or you can't remember them all later. And the biggest problem is usually you're like putting down one thing to pick up another, but you don't even really realize that. And another kind of phenomenon that happens because of working memory is that whole situation where I'm sure you've had this happen to you before, where you feel like you really understand something really well during a class or while you're studying, but then when you go to take the test, you just cannot think of what it is. And for the most part, that's because when you did understand it, you only understood it that well in your working memory. So as soon as you walked away from it, you stopped thinking about it, you forgot about it. But you felt like, oh, I really understood this so well, why can't I think of it on my test? And that's why a lot of people will say like, oh, I'm just bad at taking tests. But in reality, it's just because you can really feel like you have a strong understanding and then still lose that information later if it was only in your working memory. So your working memory is something that can kind of be fickle. It can make you feel kind of overconfident, like you've really learned and understood something, and then later when you come back to it, you might feel completely lost because when you understood it, you only understood it in your working memory. And we are going to talk about what we can do about this. This isn't all a downer. So after this, we're going to go into short-term and long-term memory and then how we can get things into long-term memory. So don't fret if you're just thinking like, wow, well, this is depressing. That we're basically saying if I learn something, I still might not actually know it. But so with that said, before we talk about long-term memory and getting things into long-term memory, let's talk about the next step up, which is short-term memory. So when we talk about short-term memory, you can probably think about like what I just told you about working memory, as well as you'll remember that in 5 minutes. Like you couldn't repeat it word for word, but you probably have a pretty good gist of it. And that is kind of like something that you have within arm's reach. So that's kind of how I would think about it. Something that you can reach from where you are right now, like something that's sitting on the table next to you. That's your short-term memory. Now, when you clear off the table, it's going to be gone. You might need to use the table later for something else. And so whatever was there, you're going to have to eventually clear out. It's not permanent. When we think about short-term memory, it's a lot like working memory, but it's kind of bigger and it's less fresh. So it's kind of like the things that we felt like we understood really well with our working memory, when we go and put that down on the table, it's still going to be there for a little while. And the better we understood it, the longer we'll be able to go back and find that in our short-term memory, whether that's 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour, but it will kind of fade over time. So maybe like 10, 11 hours after it was in your short-term memory, it might be completely gone if you didn't move it into long-term memory or do something to kind of process that information. So what's important to remember about short-term memory is that it can be retrieved a short period of time after now, but it will still eventually be forgotten later. So you just want to remember that, something that was in your working memory that you understood really well, you don't have to make sure you push that into long-term memory right away. It will still go into short-term memory, but if you don't process it pretty soon, like within a day, you will still lose that information. So you do still have to make an effort to process it. It will eventually be gone, but you don't have to be worried that if you don't process it immediately while it's in your working memory, that it's going to be gone forever, because the short-term memory will hold on to it for a little while. Now finally, we're also going to talk about long-term memory, of course. Now long-term memory, I like to kind of think of as like, if you have some boxes in your room and you're packing boxes, then that's something that will always be there. So if at some point in the future you decide you need something that you stored in a box, you could just go find that box, open it up, and there it will be. So your long-term memory is kind of like long-term storage, like something that you put in a box in your closet. So when you think about like the working memory where you were holding something, or the short-term memory where you put it down somewhere near you, then moving it into long-term memory is kind of like taking it from wherever you put it down and putting it somewhere that you'll always know where to find it. And that's kind of the basic idea. When we put something into long-term memory, our brain just knows how to find it. It's kind of like giving it an address, and then you'd be able to go and look at that address anytime to figure that out. And I'm sure you can think of things that you just kind of know, that you don't even have to question yourself about whether you know it. You just know that you know it. Like a lot of us know how to boil water or do our laundry. It doesn't even compute in our brain that we have to think about it. We just know how to do those things because they're in our long-term memory. So when we think about long-term memory, we think about something that we'll always know, something that we'll know days, weeks, or even months later. Now, there is a little caveat here, because technically, if you don't do something for long enough, or if you don't think about something for long enough, you can still forget it. So like if I didn't do my laundry for like 20 years, then I might not know how to do laundry anymore the next time I tried to do it. So it's kind of like any skill that you have can be lost if you stop doing it, if you stop practicing, if you stop thinking about that information. Alright, so now that we know about these different layers, let's talk about how we can move things between the layers, because obviously when you think about information, you can't exactly find a physical box and put that information in there. I mean, you could write notes and then put those notes somewhere, but then you'd have to actually go physically find those notes to really know that information again. It wouldn't really be in your long-term memory. But notes are a really good way that we can do this, and we'll talk more about that in a second, because when we talk about working and short-term memory and how we can move that into long-term memory, we have a couple of different skills that we can use, and writing down notes is actually a big part of that. And I don't mean notes like right now while I'm talking or while whoever you're listening to is talking. What I mean is after the lesson. So the biggest skill that I can give you today that is going to make a big difference as soon as you start doing it, as far as maintaining any information that you're trying to learn, is taking whatever you have and kind of packing the box by coming up with your own explanation without references. So let me say that again. Coming up with your own explanation of something without any references. So that would be like if you went and wrote down what you know about working memory from what I just told you. So if you turned the video off right now, if you've been taking notes, if you put those notes away somewhere that you can't even see them, and then you write down what you learned, that would be packing the box, because what you're doing is kind of like threading a needle. You're kind of taking that information from working memory and you're recalling it. So you're kind of processing it through when you try to come up with that information without any notes, which is why a lot of times one of the biggest tools teachers will use to teach their students is homework. Because if you go a couple hours from now and try to think about everything you just learned and explain it on paper, that is going to be a really great tool for your brain to say, okay, this is important. We need to put this in long-term memory. And I just want to reiterate, one of the most important things about this process is that you can't see your computer, your book, or your notes, or any kind of reference that can give you that information. That you're only using your own brain as a reference point to put this information down somewhere. So there are two main methods that I would recommend, and one of them I just kind of said, which is writing it down, and the other one is going to be talking to somebody. So the two things that you can do once you know that you can't see any references, that you can only use your own brain as a reference point, is to take a separate notepad, or go and talk to somebody, talk to a friend, talk to your spouse, talk to somebody else about what you just learned. Now, if you can go and explain that thing, whether it's to an actual other person or on a piece of paper, once you've gone through and explained that and come up with your own way of explaining that, it's going to move into long-term memory. Now, you still need to reinforce that. So there is something that happens inside of your brain when you form that connection that makes a long-term memory that can be kind of fickle. And that's what causes long-term memories to kind of fade over time. So the connection that forms between two neurons when you create a long-term memory, or really probably between a lot more than two neurons, but that's kind of getting a little too technical and it doesn't make that much of a difference. That connection can be kind of weak when you first create it. But when you reinforce that information, every time that you recall this information, whether you're explaining it to somebody, whether you're putting it into action to use it to do something, whenever you access that information in your brain with no references, you're doing something called myelinating that connection. So it's actually, there is something called a myelin sheath that protects that connection inside of your brain, and your brain knows that that connection is more important every time you recall the information. So it reinforces that connection by myelinating that connection, by improving that myelin sheath, by creating stronger protection of that connection so that it won't fade away. So now that you know how to kind of move things into long-term memory and kind of have an idea of what goes on there and how you can do it, and this is a really great tool. This is something I feel like everybody should know, and it's kind of crazy to me that this isn't common knowledge, but now that you know how you can kind of do that, let's talk about how often you want to do that, because that's the other question I get. Like, if you are trying to learn a ton of stuff at once or some new topic, how often do you need to stop and do something like write this down in a notepad or go talk to somebody about it to move things into long-term memory before you run out of space in your short-term memory and your working memory? Now, I would personally recommend after 2 to 5 smaller concepts or 1 to 3 kind of bigger major concepts that you should take a break and go and kind of myelinate, go and kind of reinforce that long-term memory. And when you do this, when you go reinforce that long-term memory, it clears out your short-term memory and your working memory and gives you the ability to kind of start thinking about new things. And this kind of leads really well into the next topic, which is information overload. So I know you've probably had this feeling before that you could not learn another thing, and you just feel like your head is going to explode. You're sitting there trying to listen to it. You might listen to or read the same piece of information 10, 20 times and still just feel like you just don't get it and you just can't get it right now. And the biggest advice that I can give to you at that moment when you feel this way is to take breaks. And I know that seems like super basic information to give you, obviously that's what you should do, take a break, right? But a lot of times people will beat themselves up about this, think that they shouldn't take a break, you should never take a break or something like that, or if I take a break I won't be able to learn quickly enough, it's going to take me too long to learn if I take a break. And you just have to tell yourself, you're just wasting your time until you do take a break sometimes. When you start to feel that information overload, you're out of space, if you don't take a break at that point, you're just going to waste your time trying to learn the same thing over and over. Now, another interesting thing that happens, even if you didn't go and kind of talk to somebody else about it or write down what you just learned, is when you take a break, this really interesting thing called diffuse learning kind of happens in the background. Now, diffuse learning is kind of like this subconscious processing that happens in your brain when you start to feel this overload feeling, because your brain knows that. It knows that you are struggling to learn something, and after you kind of walk away from it, your brain is still trying to figure it out, even if you're not consciously thinking about it. And this is a really cool tool because this is kind of what gives people those light bulb moment. Like if you're trying to think of something or explain something or figure out some kind of crazy puzzle, and then you walk away from it and start talking about something else, or you change the subject, why you'll then remember the thing you were trying to remember or think of how to solve the puzzle is because of this diffuse learning process in your brain, which is really cool because your brain is actually like doing all kinds of crazy stuff, even if you're not aware of it, to try and solve these bigger puzzles. And this is especially important when you're trying to wrap your brain around some really complex topic, because when you are and when you're in that position, you might find yourself feeling like you just can't get it, like you just don't get it, or like I'm just not smart enough is something that I hear people say sometimes, where it's not that you don't get it or you're not smart enough, it's just that your brain needs a second to kind of think on its own to figure it out so that you can come back to it refreshed and be able to understand it a little more clearly. And it's kind of weird how just taking a break and not thinking about it for a second is usually enough to get your brain to do its own bit of work, to give it the space it needs to figure things out in the background. That is one really great reason to take a break. And the other one we kind of talked about already, but I'll go over it just one more time. It's when you're at a limit. So once you feel like you just can't learn anymore, or like whatever you're trying to learn just doesn't make sense anymore, and you're not picking up anything new, you're probably just at a limit. You're probably just at a limit. You've probably just learned so much that your brain is like, whoa, give me a break, I'm out of space. And at that point, it's a good idea. To go and practice the packing of the box, assuming you have enough energy for it. So this is a good time to go and write down what you've learned so far, try and solidify what you already know so that when you come back, you'll have space to start learning those new things. Because at a certain point, you're just out of space. You're just not going to learn anything else because your brain is saying, I can only do so much. So you have to move something into long-term memory to make more space in short-term memory. And one thing that makes this so important and so powerful is that a lot of times if people do push themselves too far to try and learn too much too quickly, later you might forget about what you have learned, and that can be really demotivating. And they've actually had studies that have shown that people actually have given up because they felt like, because I forgot later, because I didn't learn everything, or I don't remember everything I was trying to learn, I must just not be able to do this. I must not be smart enough, or this topic is just not for me. I'm just not good at this. And most of the time, it's really just because your brain needed a break. It has nothing to do with you. You're probably plenty smart. You probably could still be just as good at it as anybody else, but your brain can just only handle so much. So you need to take a break so that you can kind of make sure you don't forget stuff later, because then you'll have to learn it all over again. And that kind of leads into the next piece, which is just that there's no shame or loss in taking a break. Because a lot of the time, people will say, well, I can't take a break, I have to keep going. Or if I take a break, I won't get done quick enough. And what's kind of ironic about this is that if you don't take a break, you might actually take longer to learn the concepts because you retain the information a lot better. And if you don't take a break, you might forget that information and have to learn that information again later, and you might actually wind up wasting your time, and it might take longer for you to learn the same thing. So with all of this said, I hope you guys have a lot of really cool new tools in your toolbox that you can use the next time you go to learn a new concept, and I hope this helps you to kind of retain information better and to understand that you can learn whatever new topic you're trying to learn, and that you just shouldn't give up. And that's really the number one thing I want to say is just don't give up, because for the most part, giving up is the only way that you won't learn what you're trying to learn. If you don't give up, you'll figure it out eventually, and you will get good at whatever you're trying to do. And on one final point here, I just want to also mention again that there is another follow-up video right after this one that you can go and watch now about what you can do long-term to kind of improve your brain's ability to learn more things, to learn them better, to retain them better, and to kind of help your brain to repair itself more easily and more quickly. And a lot of these things are things people don't want to do, like eat right, exercise, and get more sleep. And I've kind of given away the whole video in that one sentence. Eat right, exercise, and get some sleep. Those are kind of the things that will make your brain repair itself better. But we'll go into more detail about how and why and which things you should or shouldn't eat if you want to. And I totally understand if you don't want to get into that. I think that probably 90% of the people watching this video will not go on to the second video just because it's like a lifestyle change that it would take to improve your brain's physical health. But I hope that all of the stuff you've learned in this video is still super useful to you, even if you don't decide to go on to the next video. And I wish you the best of luck in your next learning endeavor.